200 guests stood frozen in the grand ballroom of the Harbor Crown Hotel when Victoria Langford tipped a glass of red wine over the white shirt of a stranger she believed did not belong in the room. She was 28 years old, the chief executive of Langford Water Systems, and in less than 1 minute, she would learn that the man she had just humiliated held the final signature on the largest deal of her life. The ballroom overlooked the harbor through walls of glass, and chandeliers threw soft light across a polished floor. More than 200 guests had gathered to witness the signing of the Clearwater Nexus Agreement, a $1 billion infrastructure project that Langford Water Systems had spent almost 2 years chasing. Victoria moved through the crowd in a deep emerald gown, her hair falling in soft waves, her public smile fixed and practiced. Underneath that smile, her stomach was tight with dread. If the signing did not close before midnight, a credit facility worth $180 million would roll into a punishing new interest rate, pushing the company toward the edge of default. At the far end of the room stood a man in an inexpensive but clean suit, a guest badge on his chest that read only a supplier name. His name was Michael Carter, 29 years old, standing quietly beside a nervous woman named Claire Bennett. He had no assistant, no entourage, nothing that marked him as important. Jonathan Mercer, the company's chief strategy officer, leaned toward Victoria and murmured that the man near Claire had been caught accessing internal files and pressuring an employee to hand over confidential records. When Victoria reached them, Michael spoke calmly. He said that Claire was being forced to accept blame for a file that had been altered, and he asked Victoria to pause the signing long enough to check the original data. Victoria asked who he was. Before he could answer, Jonathan announced that the man was only a representative of a vendor who had already been dropped from the project, and added almost gently that he seemed to be using his situation as a single father to gain sympathy. Michael did not react to the insult. He only said that the safety report showed signs of tampering and that the people around Victoria were too frightened to tell her the truth. The remark struck a nerve. Board members nearby had begun to notice the exchange, and Victoria felt her authority slipping at the exact moment she needed it most. She told security to remove him. Michael refused to leave until Claire was released from having to sign a statement admitting fault. Victoria asked what a man like him could possibly understand about protecting 6,000 jobs. Michael answered that no job was ever protected by a lie about safety. Jonathan added quietly that he was simply a single father trying to feel important in a room that was not his. Victoria repeated the line in front of the crowd, and in a moment she would spend months regretting. She lifted the nearest glass of red wine and poured it over his shirt. Michael looked down at the stain spreading across the fabric. He did not raise his voice, did not threaten her, and made no attempt to shame her in return. He removed his jacket, set it over the back of a chair, and said that the troubling part was not what she had just done, but that she had only felt safe doing it because she believed he could never touch her world. Then he walked out of the ballroom. Victoria believed she had ended a disturbance. 30 seconds later, Natalie Brooks, the company's general counsel, rushed toward her with a face drained of color and asked where Michael Carter had gone, because his signature was needed immediately. Victoria turned toward the closing door. Natalie told her that the man who had just left was the only person alive who could activate the entire billion-dollar transaction. 8 hours earlier, in a small house on the outskirts of Boston, Michael had been making breakfast. His daughter, Lily, 7 years old, was the only member of his family who appeared directly in this part of the story. She noticed the old suit hanging near the door and asked where her father was going. Michael told her he was meeting people who wanted to use the technology her mother had helped create. Lily asked if they were good people. Michael said that was exactly what he needed to find out. Before he left, Lily took a small star-shaped pin that had once belonged to her mother and slipped it into the inner pocket of his jacket. She told him to watch how they treated someone who could not give them anything. Michael smiled, not because it was a childish remark, but because it echoed something his late wife had always believed, that technology only mattered if the people running it respected the people it touched. Michael was not pretending to be poor to test anyone. He lived simply because he disliked public attention, and because for years, his priority had been raising his daughter. The suit he wore that night was the same one he had worn when he signed the very first licensing agreement for the Clearwater filtration technology, a system he had built years earlier with his late wife to remove heavy metals and industrial contaminants from water at a fraction of the usual cost. After her death in a car accident, Michael withdrew from public life to care for Lily, though he never gave up ownership of the core patents. He had sold a portion of the commercial rights to raise capital, but the essential intellectual property and the deciding vote on a large private equity consortium called Carter Meridian remained his. Carter Meridian was not a single fortune. It was a coalition of infrastructure funds and institutional investors, and Michael served as chairman of its special investment committee because of the value of what he had created. He did not personally control $1 billion in cash. But the Clearwater Nexus project could only move forward if he signed two required documents: a license for the use of the Clearwater patents and an approval to release $550 million in private capital. The remaining funding would come from bank loans, infrastructure bonds, and state financing. Without either of his two signatures, the entire financial structure would collapse. Carter Meridian had offered to send a car and an assistant. Michael declined. He wanted to arrive early, observe the factory, meet the team, and see how leadership handled the kind of problems that never made it into an official report. All prior negotiations had gone through lawyers, finance officers, and fund representatives. Victoria knew Michael's name only from legal paperwork. His photograph had been kept private for years, ever since he had been hounded by reporters following his wife's death. That night was meant to be the first time Victoria and Michael met in person. When he arrived at the hotel, the front desk could not locate a guest badge under his name. A vendor badge had been prepared instead, listing his name with no title at all. Michael suspected an error but did not make a scene. He accepted the badge and walked inside. From a mezzanine above, Jonathan Mercer watched him enter and recognized him immediately. Jonathan called an assistant and ordered every photograph of Michael Carter deleted from the briefing materials being prepared for Victoria. 16 months earlier, Victoria's father had suffered a stroke in the middle of a board meeting. He survived, but he never regained the ability to run the company. At the time, Langford Water Systems was carrying nearly $300 million in debt. Two major clients had canceled contracts. One factory was operating far below capacity, and the bank was threatening to call in its credit line. The board wanted to sell off the company in pieces. Victoria fought against it and took over as interim chief executive. She worked 16 hours a day, shut down unprofitable divisions, sold unnecessary assets, and personally negotiated with the union to avoid mass layoffs. After a year, Langford was still struggling, but it had pulled back from the edge of bankruptcy. Those early victories made Victoria decisive, but they also convinced her that only the strong had the right to speak up. She began telling department heads not to bring her problems without solutions already attached. Her intention had been to encourage initiative. In practice, the order taught her employees to hide bad news. Clearwater Nexus was her last real chance, a project that would fund 3 new industrial water treatment plants, secure long-term contracts with several cities, and preserve 6,000 jobs. Jonathan understood Victoria's deepest fear better than anyone: the fear of being remembered as the daughter who lost her father's company. He kept reminding her that Carter Meridian could stall the deal to extract more equity, and he warned that a rival was trying to manufacture a scandal at the very gala meant to celebrate her success. Before the event began, William Grant, the chairman of the board, told Victoria that if the contract was not signed that night, the board would hold a vote of no confidence the following morning. Victoria walked into the gala exhausted, sleep-deprived, and convinced that any disruption could destroy everything her company had left. Meanwhile, Jonathan was completing the final stage of a much older plan. Months earlier, he had quietly replaced a certified filtration material with cheaper components from a shell company called Bluestone Materials. He needed the last major stress test to fail after the contract was signed, so the blame would fall on Clearwater's technology rather than on him. Michael's unexpected appearance threatened to unravel everything before that plan could unfold. Jonathan decided Michael had to be removed before he had any chance to examine the real data. Then he saw Michael speaking quietly with Claire Bennett, the one employee still holding a copy of the original stress test report. 3 weeks before the gala, Claire had discovered something wrong. In the original stress data, the bluestone filtration membranes had begun to deform once pressure reached 74% of the design limit. But in the version sent to Carter Meridian, that number had been altered to 106%. When Claire checked the file metadata, she found that the revised report had been created 2 full days after the actual test, and that the digital signature belonging to Daniel Price, the lead engineer, had been copied without his knowledge. She brought her concerns to Jonathan, since he oversaw quality assurance. He told her it was simply a data synchronization error. When she refused to sign a confirmation statement, he transferred her out of quality control and reassigned her to event logistics for the gala. On the night of the event, Jonathan handed Claire a written statement claiming that she herself had misplaced the original file. He warned that if she refused to sign, she would be terminated for a security violation. Michael happened to overhear the end of that conversation. He did not know who Claire was, but he saw her hand trembling as she held the pen, and he asked whether she had been given the chance to contact a lawyer or a human resources representative before signing anything. Jonathan told him to leave. When Jonathan stepped away to take a phone call, Claire showed Michael a pressure chart still saved on her personal laptop. Michael recognized immediately that the curve did not match genuine Clearwater material. The expansion pattern on the chart indicated that the membrane had either been substituted or manufactured outside of approved specifications. He asked where the shipment had come from. Claire told him, Bluestone Materials, a supplier he had never approved. He told her to back up the data and to sign nothing. Jonathan returned with hotel security and loudly accused Michael of accessing confidential data and pressuring an employee to hand over files. Nearby guests began to gather. Jonathan had turned a private conversation into a public spectacle, and he summoned Victoria before Michael had a chance to reach Natalie. When Victoria arrived, all she saw was a man in an old suit standing near an internal computer terminal, a frightened employee beside him, and her most trusted strategy officer declaring that security had caught an intruder. Michael asked for 5 minutes to explain. Victoria gave him 1. He told her the test data had been altered and that the signing needed to stop. Jonathan asked if Michael had proof. Michael answered that the original data was the proof, and that Jonathan himself was the one pressuring an employee to take the blame for its disappearance. In that moment, Victoria felt as though Michael was accusing her most trusted executive in front of hundreds of guests. Jonathan's arrogance, the crushing pressure of the deal, and months of quiet manipulation collided at once, and it pushed her toward the moment that would define the rest of the night: the wine, the humiliation, and the door closing behind a man she did not yet know she needed. Before leaving the gala, Michael had quietly slipped Claire a business card carrying an emergency contact number for Carter Meridian. After Natalie confirmed Michael's true identity, the ballroom dissolved into chaos. Victoria demanded to know why no one had warned her he would be attending. Natalie explained that the full briefing file had been sent a week earlier, but the version circulating that night was missing his photograph and his arrival schedule, and that the editing rights for that file belonged to Jonathan's office. Jonathan feigned surprise and blamed his assistant and the events team. William insisted that Victoria call Michael back at any cost. He suggested offering additional equity, waiving licensing fees, or issuing a public apology. Michael did not answer his phone. The next morning, Langford received a formal legal notice from Carter Meridian. The deal had not been canceled. It had been frozen for 72 hours under a safety risk clause buried deep in the agreement. The notice required Langford to take 3 immediate actions: to halt all testing involving the bluestone filtration batches, to preserve every relevant email, camera recording, and purchase record, and to protect any employee who came forward with information from termination or retaliation. If Langford failed to comply, Michael would refuse to license the Clearwater patents, and Carter Meridian would withdraw its entire $550 million commitment. Jonathan secretly leaked footage of Victoria pouring the wine. He fed reporters a story suggesting that Michael was seeking personal revenge for being insulted. Public opinion split tie-tie. Some criticized Victoria's arrogance. Others accused Michael of using his financial power to destroy a young female executive. Langford's stock price fell sharply. Victoria went to the Carter Meridian offices expecting a gleaming executive tower. Instead, Michael worked from a modest office beside a small research lab. Victoria opened with the words that she did not know who he was. Michael answered that this was exactly the problem. He told her that if she was only apologizing now that she understood his power, the apology was nothing more than a negotiation. Victoria tried to explain the pressure of protecting 6,000 jobs. Michael answered that pressure could explain an action, but it did not erase responsibility. He showed her the pressure chart Claire had provided. If the data was genuine, the filtration modules being prepared for the next stress test could rupture at a load far below what the official reports claimed. Michael did not demand her resignation. He asked her to go to the factory floor herself, speak to the people she had overlooked, and find out what had actually happened. The final stress test, he reminded her, would begin in less than 20 hours. Victoria arrived at the Clearwater plant without alerting the press. Workers watched her with visible caution. They had seen her image on internal broadcasts, but most had never spoken to their chief executive in person. She gathered department heads and demanded every quality control file. No one gave her a straight answer. Daniel Price stepped forward. He had once led the stress testing program before being quietly stripped of authority for objecting to the bluestone material. Daniel told her that his team had submitted 3 separate warning reports. One had been returned for lacking a proposed solution. The other 2 had simply vanished from the system. Victoria asked why he'd never sent the warnings directly to her. Daniel answered that anyone who had ever brought bad news to the chief executive's office had been treated as if they lacked competence. The remark stung, but this time, Victoria did not argue. Claire arrived at the plant with Natalie beside her for protection. She produced an email proving she had sent a warning directly to Victoria's office months earlier. Natalie checked the system logs and discovered that the messages had been automatically rerouted into a folder controlled by Jonathan's assistant. Victoria realized she had never deleted the warnings herself, but the culture she had built made it possible for Jonathan to do it without ever being questioned. She walked the length of the production floor with Daniel beside her, stopping to ask individual workers how long they had known something was wrong, and why no one had ever felt safe enough to say it to her directly. The answers were quiet and consistent, and each one landed harder than the last. She reinstated Claire and restored Daniel's access. She signed an order protecting whistleblowers, forbidding any manager from terminating an employee connected to the investigation. William objected, warning that the order exposed the company to lawsuits. Victoria signed it anyway. It was the first time Michael watched her choose the truth even when it came at a cost. Daniel and Michael opened one of the installed filtration modules. The color and internal structure were completely different from the approved Clearwater material. Michael confirmed it did not meet the certified specification. An inventory check revealed that 240 identical modules had already been installed throughout the plant. Victoria immediately ordered the test canceled. The system returned an error stating that the operating schedule had been locked by an administrator account with elevated permissions. The only account able to override it belonged to Jonathan. Security rushed to his office. Jonathan had already vanished. His company laptop remained on the desk, but the hard drive had been removed. The system flagged that Jonathan's account had just logged in from a device outside the building. Word of Jonathan's disappearance spread through the plant within the hour, and the mood among the staff shifted from confusion to quiet alarm. Employees who had spent years staying silent began approaching Daniel and Claire in small groups, admitting that they too had noticed irregularities in the shipment logs, but had been too afraid to say anything out loud. Victoria listened to each account without interrupting, and for the first time she understood how far the fear inside her own company had spread beneath the surface of confident presentations and quarterly reports. Michael, Victoria, Claire, Daniel, and Natalie formed an emergency investigation team. Claire cross-referenced shipment codes and found that Bluestone's quality certifications had been copied from an older, legitimate supplier. Natalie pulled corporate filings and discovered Bluestone was registered to a rented office space with no factory and only 2 employees on paper. Over 6 months, Langford had paid Bluestone more than $21 million. Daniel estimated the real value of the material delivered was closer to $7 million. The difference had disappeared. Natalie traced the money through a chain of intermediary accounts leading to a fund called North Harbor Capital. North Harbor was holding a substantial position in put options against Langford stock, a bet that would pay handsomely if the company's share price collapsed. A draft agreement showed that Jonathan was set to be appointed chief executive if North Harbor acquired Langford after the company defaulted. Natalie printed the entire chain of transactions and laid it across the conference table, tracing each transfer with a marker until the pattern became impossible to deny even for those in the room who had trusted Jonathan for years. The plan came into full focus. First, replace certified materials with cheap substitutes to siphon money. Next, sabotage the stress test and let the blame fall on Michael's patented technology. Then force Carter Meridian to withdraw, dragging the banks and infrastructure funds down with it. Finally, let North Harbor buy Langford at a fraction of its value, install Jonathan as chief executive, and sell the Clearwater data to a competitor. The team still lacked direct proof that Jonathan had deliberately sabotaged the test. Jonathan struck back from outside the building. He released a video edited to make Michael appear to be sneaking into a restricted data room during the gala. He sent the board a fabricated dossier suggesting Carter Meridian was orchestrating a hostile takeover of Langford. William called an emergency meeting and presented Victoria with 2 choices. The first, accept a rescue loan from North Harbor, publicly accuse Michael of misconduct, and keep her position. The second, continue the investigation, refuse North Harbor's money, and risk being suspended for allowing the stock to collapse. The North Harbor loan could keep the company afloat for 3 months, but it came with the right to lay off workers and sell company assets. Victoria understood that accepting the loan might save her title, while surrendering the company to the very people trying to destroy it. She refused. The board voted to suspend part of her operating authority. At that moment, Daniel received an urgent alert from the plant. The stress test had begun automatically, 6 hours ahead of schedule, and the emergency shutdown protocol had been altered using Jonathan's account before he disappeared. The test had not been triggered by Jonathan pressing a remote button somewhere far away. Before fleeing, he had used his legitimate administrator privileges to change the test schedule, raise the pressure ceiling, and disable several automatic warning systems. The plant's own system treated these changes as approved commands. By the time Daniel discovered what had happened, the main valves had already closed and pumps were forcing test solution through the filtration array. If the Bluestone modules failed, the solution could flood the production floor, injure dozens of workers, and contaminate the industrial wastewater system. William urged Victoria to keep the incident quiet, hoping the technical team could resolve it internally and avoid another blow to the stock price. Victoria understood that ordering an evacuation would publicly confirm the company had a safety problem, and it would likely end her career. She ordered the evacuation anyway. William reminded her that her authority had already been suspended. Daniel told her the operating team would still follow her, because it was the safest possible order in the moment. Victoria called the fire department, the environmental agency, and local authorities, choosing full disclosure over concealment. Michael arrived in the control room. He studied the system schematic and realized that Jonathan had locked the automatic drainage sequence, but a mechanical backup pathway, designed years earlier during the original prototype phase, still existed. 3 valves needed to be opened in a precise sequence. Michael was not certified to enter the hazardous area himself, so he guided the effort from the control room while Daniel and the response team, wearing full protective gear, carried out the sequence in the field. Victoria checked the personnel roster and discovered 2 maintenance workers were still inside the eastern section of the plant. William told her that senior leadership should not remain in a dangerous facility. Victoria refused to leave until every worker had been confirmed safe. The monitors showed pressure climbing past the point where the bluestone material had begun to deform in the original test data. A sensor flagged the first crack forming in a module. Michael estimated they had only a few minutes before the entire filtration array failed. Daniel opened the first valve successfully. When the team reached the second valve, They found it seized from months of neglected maintenance, its service record deliberately erased from the schedule. Michael remembered an older balancing tank behind the primary line, used during the very earliest prototype phase, but excluded from current operating documentation. Redirecting pressure into that tank could buy critical time, but if the tank itself could not withstand the load, the consequences would be far worse. Michael did not issue orders like a man used to being obeyed without question. He explained the risk clearly to Daniel, and let the person actually on site make the final call. Daniel agreed to proceed. Meanwhile, Claire received an alert that someone had entered the administrative building. Camera footage showed Jonathan returning through a service corridor, intending to reach the financial servers, erase the wire transfer records, and retrieve the draft agreement with North Harbor. Claire did not attempt to confront him directly. She locked down the data wing from the security office and called the police. Jonathan forced open a side door, but Natalie had already triggered a legal preservation order, backing up the data to an independent server before he could reach it. Back at the test site, pressure kept climbing. Daniel opened the pathway to the balancing tank. The valve responded more slowly than expected. The first module ruptured, and test solution began leaking into a protective containment area. Michael instructed the team to open the third valve 3 seconds earlier than planned. Daniel executed the change. Pressure dropped suddenly, then spiked again when a secondary line became blocked. One of the 2 missing workers was found in the eastern hallway. The other was trapped inside a maintenance room after an automatic safety door had sealed shut. Victoria directed the rescue team to that location. She remained in the control room, tracking the evacuation list and staying in constant contact with the fire department. Daniel used a manual crank to fully open the second valve. Pressure redirected into the balancing tank moments before the entire filtration line exceeded its limit. The system began to stabilize. Steam rose from the cooling lines as the pressure gauges slowly settled back toward their normal range, and for a moment no one in the control room spoke, watching the numbers fall as if any sound might reverse the progress. The last trapped worker was brought out with a minor shoulder injury, wrapped in a blanket, and walked to a waiting ambulance while his colleagues applauded from a safe distance. No one was killed. Police arrested Jonathan inside the data wing as he attempted to force open a locked cabinet holding backup servers. In his possession, officers found a removed hard drive, a passport, and financial transfer documents. The evidence that followed proved Jonathan had deliberately altered the test schedule and deleted safety warnings. Michael now held the legal right to invoke a takeover clause against Langford for violating the terms of their agreement. Williams suggested this was Carter Meridian's opportunity to acquire the company at a fraction of its value. Michael refused. He told them the purpose of the deal was to build 3 water treatment plants and protect the water supply, not to profit from a crisis. Jonathan had been arrested, but the deal remained frozen, and Victoria still had to answer for a system of leadership that had allowed the conspiracy to exist in the first place. The next day, Victoria held a press conference. Her lawyers urged her to place the entire blame on Jonathan and present herself as a victim of his deception. Victoria refused. She acknowledged that Jonathan was the one who had committed the crimes, but she admitted that her own style of leadership had created an environment where he could hide his wrongdoing. She had told employees not to bring her problems without solutions attached. She had mistaken silence for loyalty. She had trusted people with senior titles over the people who actually worked with the systems every day. Victoria publicly described humiliating Michael at the gala. She did not soften the act by claiming she had only done it under pressure. She apologized to Claire first, because Claire was the one she had ignored long before she ever understood Michael's influence. Afterward, she apologized to Michael, though she asked for neither forgiveness nor a signature on any contract. She announced a resignation as chief executive and gave up the bonus tied to the deal, redirecting the money into a compensation fund for employees who had faced retaliation in the past. Michael still did not renew the agreement. Carter Meridian proposed a 6-month recovery plan. Langford would be required to establish an independent safety board with worker representatives and outside experts. Every quality control report would be stored on a system no single manager could alter alone. Whistleblowers would be protected under enforceable contracts. Leadership would receive no bonuses until safety benchmarks were met, and the supply chain would undergo public auditing. For 6 months, Victoria served only in a transitional advisory role, without unilateral decision-making power. She accepted every condition. She moved her workspace from the executive tower to an office at the plant itself. She attended night shift meetings, spoke with employees who had once filed complaints no one addressed, and helped redesign how warnings were received and acted upon. Michael kept his distance. He did not turn himself into her moral instructor. He simply watched the results. Over 6 months, the number of reported safety concerns rose sharply, while the number of actual accidents fell. It proved that employees no longer feared telling the truth. The new safety board recommended reinstating Victoria as chief executive, though with authority now limited by independent oversight. The final decision required Michael's vote. 9 months after the night of the gala, the first Clearwater Nexus plant completed its full independent certification. Daniel was appointed Director of Safety and Quality. Claire joined the newly formed Ethics Board, with the authority to report directly to the Oversight Committee without routing anything through the Chief Executive's office. All 240 Bluestone modules were destroyed. The new supplier was required to disclose its manufacturing process publicly and submit to regular independent inspection. 6,000 jobs remained intact. Investigators charged Jonathan with fraud, embezzlement, industrial sabotage, securities manipulation, and theft of trade secrets. His trial would come later, since the story did not end with an unrealistic conviction handed down in a single afternoon. The new safety board invited Victoria back into the chief executive role, her authority now bound by the safety board and worker representation. Michael voted in favor. He did not do it because he had forgotten the wine glass. He did it because Victoria had spent 9 months repairing a broken system, without knowing whether she would ever be allowed to return. The billion-dollar deal was reactivated in stages. Funds would only be released once each safety milestone had been completed. The plant's opening ceremony did not take place inside a luxury hotel. It happened on the production floor, surrounded by engineers, workers, and members of the surrounding community. Lily did not attend the event. After the ceremony ended, Michael received a short voice message from her, asking whether the people at the company turned out to be good after all. He looked across the room and saw Victoria speaking with a group of workers, standing among them rather than in the section reserved for executives. He answered that one person had once made a very serious mistake, but that she had not run away when it came time to fix it. Victoria walked over carrying 2 paper cups of coffee. She handed one to Michael, and said that the last time, she had chosen the wrong drink entirely, and that this time, she wanted to begin with respect instead. Michael accepted the cup. He did not say that everything had been forgotten, and he made no promise about anything beyond that conversation. He simply agreed to sit down and speak with her, not as an executive and an investor, but as 2 people willing to start over. Around them, the production floor hummed with the quiet, steady sound of machinery running exactly as it was designed to run, no longer hiding a fault line waiting to open beneath the surface. Workers moved between stations, without the tension that had once followed every visit from someone in a suit, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, Victoria felt like a guest in her own company, rather than someone bracing for the next disaster. The story closed on a clear contrast. A glass of red wine had once been used to humiliate a man Victoria believed had no power at all. A cup of coffee was now offered with respect, after she had finally learned to see the value in people who could give her nothing in return. Michael had once held enough power to destroy Victoria entirely, to buy Langford at a fraction of its worth, and to turn a moment of humiliation into a billion-dollar act of revenge. But he understood that revenge only punished one person. Justice had the power to change an entire system, and that was the choice he made when it mattered most.